Day by day our lives are turning, like a potter's wheel they spin. You are choosing your own maker. Choose your potter's wheel, my friend.
It's time for us to talk a little bit about the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24:15. It seems to be very cryptic, and we should be careful that we not make it so mysterious that we stop using sound principles of interpretation and start guessing or applying it to our pet doctrines. We actually have three very important clues to help us pin down the time and event Jesus is speaking of. The first clue is in the immediate context. We've already seen that these things were to take place in the generation to which Jesus was speaking. If you missed that, I'll put a link right up here. Since this is the case, the abomination of desolation would be seen by the disciples to whom Jesus was speaking. The second clue is a remote context, which is a parallel passage to Matthew 24. And the third clue will be what Daniel says about this, since Jesus actually tells us that Daniel spoke of it. Let's begin by talking about what the abomination of desolation actually means. The phrase refers to a detestable thing that makes desolate. Some want to make it a detestable person that makes desolate. However, this is very unlikely since the word abomination is in the neuter gender. It is far more appropriate to think in terms of a thing rather than a person. This word abomination is also used in Luke 16:15, where Jesus said, "You are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God." The word detestable in the verse is the same word translated abomination in Matthew 24:15. It refers to something that is disgusting or repulsive. It is also found in Revelation 21:27, where we read about what will not be in the city of God. There we read, "Nothing unclean and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it." In the Old Testament, the concept of an abomination comprehended the idea of what would cause God's destruction, as we just saw in Revelation 21. As Jesus uses it in Matthew 24, it hints at the desolation Jerusalem has earned for herself, with the abomination being a sign of it occurring. To explain that, we need to consider Luke's account of this same conversation in Matthew 24. When Luke wrote this down, he presented these words, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand." That's in Luke 21 and verse 20. You can look at the language around that verse and see that this sentence is in the very same place as Matthew 24:15. However, in Matthew 24:15, they can see an abomination of desolation, but in Luke 21:20, they see armies that cause desolation. Whether you see the Roman army itself as this abomination of desolation or the idolatrous banners carried before them, it's obvious that Jesus is referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, the third resource for study here is the book of Daniel itself. Jesus specifically tells us that Daniel referred to this. Well, there are three possibilities in the book of Daniel. The first is Daniel 9:27, which says, "And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate." The second passage is Daniel 11:31, which says, "And forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation." Now the third is Daniel 12 and verse 11. "And from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. So which of these passages is it? Well, it's not Daniel 11:31. That doesn't set well with some people, but the reason I conclude that is in the context. I've already covered that in another video, and I'll put a link to it right up here. Now, the references in Daniel 9 and 12 do refer to this event in Matthew 24. Keep watching that video I just gave you, and it'll go right down into chapter 12. And here's a link to a video on Daniel 9, which goes over the intention of that statement there. Now, to sum up, the abomination of desolation appeared at the coming destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. The people would know destruction was near as the Romans marched on the city. The zealots would stay and fight, but disciples would know to flee the coming destruction. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. Our next video will study the amazing signs that are related beginning in verse 29. We'll consider, with a Bible answer, what is actually going on in this text. I hope you'll join me for that study.